Welcome to Afros and Audio's Black History Month interview series. My name is Talib Jasir, founder and CEO of Afros and Audio Podcast Festival, the first two-day conference formed by Black independent podcast creatives and audio professionals. I'm excited to spotlight 28 outstanding indie podcast creatives who answered the call to be a part of this series. Today, my guest is Shamiko Reid. Welcome, and thank you for being here. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me.
Good. I'm excited to talk to you today. We've connected so many times, but never really focused in on the podcast and who you are for others who may not know you. I happen to have the privilege of knowing you. So I'm happy.
Me too.
How are you today? We'll definitely talk about the podcast, but I want people to know a bit about Shamiko. Talk to us about you.
About me. Today I'm doing well. I was just sharing with Talib off screen that I was under the weather, but overall I'm a pretty even-keeled person 90% of the time. I am a writer at heart, and my podcast came as a supplement to my blog. I've always loved writing, just my own thoughts and just different creative ideas. And I look forward to getting back to that this year. And I'm a mom now. It's been almost 3 years. I can't believe it. It's literally a blur. So just finally getting back to being present.
All right. Talk to us about the Discussion Room podcast.
The Discussion Room is my first podcast project. As I shared, it is like a supplement of my blog. So in 2015, I started blogging about my daddy issues. My biological father was incarcerated cyclically for most of my childhood and adulthood. And I had two other primary figures who stepped in his absence. And I was 23 years old, 24, and realizing that there was some residue left from my upbringing and how it caused me to deal with people in relationships, not just romantic relationships, but friendships and business as well. And I think my cousin got married or something like that. And my first thing that I wrote down was called weddings, and how weddings made me feel, and thinking about who's going to walk me down the aisle. And so from then on, I just started to write down my reflections about my upbringing and the things that I overlooked that were resurfacing and interfering with how I showed up in my relationships with others. So those reflections turned into my blog. I had read a book called Blogging to Book, because as I shared, I've always been a writer and I wanted to write a book so bad. It's like, okay, if I can get a blog going and get people interested in my blog, then I'll feel confident and write this book. And it was catharsis for me. I would write while I was at work, then go home and review it, type it up, publish it. And I was doing that 2 days a week for most of 2015 to 2017. And then someone said to me, "Sis, you need a podcast." And I didn't necessarily understand what podcasting was just yet, but I had learned about a free podcasting tool, and that I could take audio from Facebook Lives to create the podcast. And I had done a few interesting conversations with other people to supplement my blog. So the first one, at the time, I was in a marketing program with a marketing coach trying to get more viewers on my blog. And that person was trying to get me to give my blog posts more interesting titles. And they kept saying something very specific. And I said, that sounds like real personal for you. Do you want to talk about it? And so we talked about it on Facebook Live, and the topic was what my cheating ass daddy taught me about empathy. And so that was the subject line they kept suggesting. I was like, that's not my story, but I did have similar content that I featured on my blog that month. And we just had a Facebook Live at the end of the month. And so from then on, once a month, I would find somebody with something to share that related to whatever reflections I had been sharing on my blog for that month. And that became my podcast, The Discussion Room, where daddy issues drive discussion.
Wow. That's a unique story for your podcast journey. I love that. So how did you, and you talked about sourcing that first guest, and it was someone you were currently having conversations with. So it was like, why not? Let's have a discussion. But how have you sourced your guests since then?
Mostly a combination of things, either pre-existing relationships or someone suggests them. So that first person had a live event that I went to, and somebody in the audience had an interesting business. They taught sex ed. They went into schools, them and their business partner and their best friend at the time. They still friends. I don't want to say it like that, but these two young women went into schools teaching sex education, and they were talking about how important it is to have comprehensive sex education, especially in the Black and Brown communities. And I felt like that was an interesting topic. I liked what they were sharing at that live event we were in. I reached out to them and I interviewed them and their co-host about their upbringing and their first sexual experiences with their father's reaction or lack of father in the home. What was that like? What drives this work that you do? And so that has become like the backbone of the discussion room. It's about how your relationship or lack thereof with your father or father figures influences who you are and how you show up in the world. So it's not just like, woe is me, I didn't have a dad, or I had too many dads, or my dad was mean to me. I talked to somebody who had perfect daddy syndrome. And so they are 40 plus and still unwed because they are having a difficult time finding someone who lives up to the standards that their father has set for them. And so it's just different people that I meet along the way. I email people. If I actually was listening to a podcast and they had done live interviews, which strays away from that particular podcast regular format. And in this live interview series, someone said something, one sentence that struck me. I reached out to them. I found them on Instagram from the show notes. I reached out to them and they agreed to be a guest. So sometimes I reach out to people I don't know. Sometimes it's people I do know. I've interviewed people who I've dated, just different things. If I know that you have a story to tell, a lot of times some people volunteer or they'll say, hey, I know this person that would be great for your podcast. But most of the time, it really is just connecting with people. A lot of people just open up to me. Some of the guests that I've had, I met them somewhere else and we were catering and they're telling me stories. I'm like, ooh, why did you decide to share that with me? But actually, you should share that with my audience.
That's great, Shamiko. I love that. So as you've moved forward from your first podcast episode to now, how would you say that you refined or pivoted or adjusted your content or your podcast, if at all, since the beginning?
Well, in the beginning, like I said, it was snatched from a Facebook Live. I then learned about using audio from Zoom and scheduling these calls privately as opposed to doing it as a live. And content-wise and format-wise, once I became a parent, I shared with you, my child's 2.5 now. I had, during my pregnancy, it was the pandemic, everything was shut down. So I wasn't meeting people the same way. Lots of things had changed. And I also was in this awkward space being pregnant during the pandemic and just feeling isolated. So I stopped producing my podcast for a while. I did maybe 2 or 3 interviews during the first half of my pregnancy and then just chilled. And then once I had the baby, it was harder to do because babies make noise, babies need things. And so the scheduling became different, but it also influenced my content. I was no longer solely focusing on my upbringing, but now how my upbringing is influencing my parenting choices, not just focusing on my fathers and my father figures, but just my ideas around parenting overall and where they came from. Everything wasn't just about my actual parents and my household or my stepfathers or anything like that. Some of it was aunts and uncles, some of it was friends' parents, some of it was things that I've seen on TV. And so I talk about that. Like right now, there's a show on TV where there are different parents have different parenting styles and they face challenges. And I've been sharing those things in my Instagram stories, but I have a podcast episode I plan to share on that. And I have a publication I'd like to pitch my op-ed in response to this show, because I think, it started from a very personal space for me. I was academically excelling for most of my life. I didn't feel that my father's incarceration had impacted me at all. And then I realized there's a lot of things that I didn't know about myself. There were a lot of things that happened in my interactions with him that influenced the way that I moved or didn't move and what I tolerated and didn't tolerate from friends, from romantic partners, and or just allowed because I didn't know how to be vocal or stand up for myself in certain situations. So instead of solely focusing on that, I get to change the dynamic and change the narrative and say, this is what I'm doing differently. I've done all that reflection in the past few years about how my parents' decisions has influenced who I've become and how I show up as an adult. And now I'm sharing with you my challenges and trying to move differently and not make the same things that I view as mistakes, the same decisions that I view as mistakes that happened when people were parenting me, or just that sometimes they did make mistakes, and now that the shoe's on the other foot is like, I understand. I get it differently now, So my content has shifted in that way. I've done more solo episodes. And in terms of production, someone else that Bethany over at Crackers and Soup, she did a workshop one time in Women of Color Podcasters that Danielle runs about editing audio. And so I learned about Audacity. So I learned to go back and edit some things out and give clarity to older episodes where people are like, I want to know what y'all talking about, but it's so loud. That first episode that was a Facebook Live, they were in the airport. They were in the airport with some Target headphones on. And I didn't know anything about podcasting or what the audio should sound like or what to have a guest prepare for. So I've learned some audio production to go back. Danielle and WC Podcasters curated a lot of different workshops in my time in that community where I've learned about improving my show notes. So I had a website where my blog was held, and now I've been able to go back in some of the older podcast episodes, create show notes and websites so that it improves my SEO and gets more eyes on that content. So just learning lots of different things. It's challenging as a team of one to do all of that, especially for a back catalog. And so production is kind of on pause because I want to be prepared to do it better. The next interview that I have or the next solo episode I have, I want to be prepared. Like, all right, I'm gonna record now while I don't have my child, and I'm going to have the time to use what I learned from Bethany in editing and use what I learned from Aquania and Danielle to create these show notes so that I don't feel overwhelmed trying to do it later.
That's great. I really appreciate you sharing that because I think it will help a lot of people that may be in the same conversation. A lot of people, once they record and distribute and push it out, they're done. Like they might even feel a bit of shame around it for the rest of their lives. Don't even want to talk about it. Or delete it altogether. But it is important that this is podcasting is one of those mediums where you can go back and you can update and you can republish it if you're in a good platform. Something like Libsyn is capable of doing that, and I'm sure a lot of the others. You created the podcast from a space, most people from a space of value add. And so it's important. I think that it's important that we are able to go back and refine what we've already put out there. So I really appreciate you sharing that story. That's good stuff.
Yeah, I learned a lot from other people. Another tip that was joining a community. And so one of the pillars of that community was educating other podcasters. And so that's something, it continues to benefit me. And in terms of editing, I'm still a team of one. I couldn't afford at the time to outsource. And I made it fun. I like music. My uncle was a DJ. He was like the primary father figure that I had, my mom's older brother. And I used to beg him to teach me to DJ as a kid. And later. He didn't want me touching all the equipment and stuff. But now that I know how to podcast, I can snatch the audio from here and mix it and bring this down and bring this up. And I created intros just using some of my favorite songs that related to the episodes or what we were going to be talking about to make some of the topics. We might have a heavy conversation, but it can make it lighthearted in the beginning, or just me talking over the music and getting the energy up before people listen to this conversation. So I made it fun for myself. I'm still learning. I'm not perfect at it yet, but I just found a way to marry things that I enjoy. And like you said, refine what was already there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned, it can also be very creative. And for those of us who are creative, that supports, you're getting in there and you're pulling audio from here to there and you're kind of making it linear and putting the music in and all of that. It's a creative process as well. A lot of us don't think of it that way because it's so arduous, but it can be a creative process. So I appreciate you sharing that. What would you say to date would be one of your biggest wins for Discussion Room?
So a friend of mine decided it wasn't in alignment with their business model at the time, but something that had been on their mind was having a fatherless Father's Day brunch. And since I talked a lot about, people's fathers or lack of a relationship with their father, they asked me if I would be willing to co-host this event with them. And so in 2018, we had the inaugural Fatherless Father's Day brunch in Baltimore, Maryland, and people were able to come. And I think I consider that one of my biggest wins because it was organic. Somebody brought the idea to me. I put it out there. We actually in 2017 tried to do it as a Facebook Live. And at the time, Facebook was just allowing people to like co-host lives, but we couldn't get it right, whatever. It didn't work out. And so we did for 2018 get to have an intimate in-person brunch where people who I had met at other events or spoken on panels about being fatherless or that daddy-daughter relationship from my perspective were able to come, and I got to know them on a better level, not just as the host of this event or what they invited me to speak on, what their personal journey was. And I loved that event because it was organic. It wasn't for views. It wasn't for likes. We didn't take a whole bunch of pictures. I wasn't recording. And I definitely wish in hindsight that I had been, because so much valuable information was shared. Rich stories were shared, but I think it lent to why those people showed up. They trusted me. They trusted the person I was co-hosting with. And we created an environment where they were able to be raw and vulnerable and, not worry about it resurfacing on Facebook or Instagram or anything later. So I consider that one of my biggest podcast wins, because had I not started that blog that led to that podcast, I wouldn't have met that individual who assisted me in creating that safe space for those people that day. And in 2019, I did a brunch tour on my own. So I did Philly, Atlanta, New Jersey. I had another city that we had to remove from the tour, but 3 cities is not bad for one person. And I had more people sign up in Atlanta at the last minute than I was prepared for, but it gave me a different perspective on how to move forward. We didn't have another one because, of course, the pandemic and my pregnancy in 2020. And I just haven't had the opportunity to decide whether it's something we want to move forward with. But for what it was worth in that time and in that space, I'm very proud of what we produced.
Wow, that's really dope. And that so much can come from, like you said, starting the blog, starting the podcast. So much can occur because of it. And that's something that we definitely want to encourage people to understand. You can't even see what's coming. You didn't have any idea that was coming when you started your blog, but it did. I think it was in 2020 for us, Latrice and AJ, 2 folks that worked at Latrice in the past and AJ still currently working with Afros and Audio. We did a conversation called The Healing Power of Podcasting. And I just wanted to bring that up because you mentioned it was cathartic, starting and telling these stories. Where do you feel like you are in your own healing journey, your own understanding and perspective? You talked about now that you're a parent, you kind of get it from a different angle. How has the journey been since the beginning of getting those feelings out to today for you?
It is definitely an emotional roller coaster, because the more you grow, sometimes the more you unearth. Like when you have a plant, you got to dig it up and make sure you secure the roots before repotting it in a bigger pot so that it has the space to grow. And so sometimes those roots get exposed and it's like touching a nerve. So I'm constantly learning, constantly growing. At the time when I started the blog, I was working at an outpatient mental health center, but I wasn't a recipient of therapy myself. And so since then, I've started going to therapy for me and not just relying on writing or podcasting to be that catharsis for me, but actually seeking professional support and healing. And that's been challenging as well. Like when you're someone who has quote unquote done the work on your own, and you kind of have the tools that a lot of people get in therapy, it makes finding a good therapist who can challenge you and push you a bit more challenging. But in terms of my own personal healing, I think one of my biggest therapy goals was learning to communicate and communicate in the present. So I became a lover of writing because there were lots of things that I felt like I couldn't say to certain people, either at all or in that moment. Like maybe I'm so angry, I don't want to say hurtful things, so I'm going to go write it down. Or maybe there's a power dynamic here that's awkward for me, or I'm, the lesser end of that power dynamic, and saying what I want to say could have, consequences I don't want to face. So I leaned on writing, and then podcasting gave me my voice back. And so I was able to say some of the things that I used to just write about, and saying them out loud, whether to the camera, the microphone, or another person. If I was having a conversation and an interview with someone, gave me the courage to say, well, if I can say these things out into the public, maybe I should be able to say these things directly to the people who I need to say them to. And so podcasting has helped with that. Therapy has helped with that. And timing. My family would say to me, you get so angry, but you don't tell us until we don't remember. Like, you hold on to the moment and you're angry, and by the time you're ready to talk about it, we don't even remember what it is we did that was bothering you. And so I think that those things have helped. Those things have changed. I have grown in those areas. And it's interesting being able to put that into work with childs too. So they don't care. 2-year-olds don't care about anything. But it's like, okay, I don't want you to fear me. I want you to respect me. How do I get someone who has limited language capacity in general to be comfortable talking to me? I can't explode and be angry when you want to tell me things, or when you have an accent. Potty training is bananas. So, just learning to communicate, learning to be patient and exercise patience, and just be who I needed, extend that grace, and continue to not take things personally. Like I shared earlier, podcasting has helped me see parents as people, and not just my parents, but just like listening to other people's stories. It's like, okay, you want, when it's not your situation, to extend grace and understanding. It's like, well, maybe your parent was going through this or going through that. And so my biological father is currently incarcerated right now, and I feel differently about it than I ever had, or than I ever had in my adult life. As a child, I remember being sad and wanting to spend time, and just like, oh, why you don't get to be around? But now as a parent, and for years I was closed off. I wanted no relationship. It was like, listen, you keep doing stuff to get you there. You done missed out on most of my life. I don't really need a father anyway. And saying that is bananas, because just talking to people, it's like, dang, my mom is almost 50 and her siblings are over 50, and they talk to their father all the time. They still need him. Thankfully, he's still around for them to need. Why is it that people who have absentee fathers feel like once we reach 18 or whatever, we don't need a father anymore? There's always a need if that person is behaving in that role. And so shortly before my child was born, I began just spending more time and trying to get to know my father as a person, and not just this person who hurt me, and getting to learn who he was, because I had heard things from my mother, from his siblings, from other people who knew him and went to school with him, but I didn't necessarily hear about him from him. And I feel differently about his incarceration this time, because I was finally taking the time to get to know him directly from the source. And, I have nieces and nephew. I have a child, and I feel like he was doing what he needed to do to be present for them, or at least making an attempt to. And then now you no longer have the opportunity to. So there have been lots of developments and changes and growth that has happened, and sometimes relapses.
Absolutely. And then understanding our society in general that keeps that cycle alive, trapped in so many ways. And one of the things that I really appreciate, one, about this interview series, but really talking to you, is that these conversations, it's podcast related, but it goes beyond podcasting, right? Podcasting becomes a medium of expression and outlet for some of the things that we have gone through or currently go through. But it is that space for, and something I think is very important for us as a people, is to be able to express and not stuff and repress so much of what is hard to deal with. James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's faced, right? So I really appreciate you sharing all of that. I know for a fact that I've been touched, moved, and inspired by this conversation. So I know the same thing is going to happen for folks who get to listen to this. So I want to start winding this down. This has been a great conversation. You dropped a lot of gems, and which I knew you would. And what is interesting is that I do some talking in this, but I'm just listening. I like listening to you, Shamiko. I really do. So when you think about folks who are aspiring in the podcasting or looking to find a creative expression or find their voice, what would be your tips based on your own experience?
I was recommended to read a book called Start With Why. I never finished that book. I don't have a problem with it, but I do think the title is a good place, a good recommendation. Start with why. For me, I started podcasting as a suggestion because somebody saw value in what I was blogging about. I was having these speaking engagements in different, communities. I was traveling all the way to Philly. I was living in Baltimore and I was traveling to Philly for all these different things that someone who had a community there, felt like, hey, we need you here. I almost moved to Philly because of that. But my why behind my podcast was really like, could I get more people to read my blog? Because ultimately I wanted to write a book. It's been 8 years almost, still no book. And somebody said to me, the book is already written, you just haven't put it together. And so that helped perspective wise, but definitely start with why, because I talked about community. I talked about, a particular community where I learned a lot, technical skills in terms of podcasting, but also in the Black Podcasters Association, I learned a lot about the business industry of podcasting. And I'm a lover of learning. And sometimes information can be an overload if you don't take the time to execute it. And if you are learning and the things that you're learning are making you feel like you are working against yourself, maybe take a break from consuming information. Comparison is the thief of joy. Somebody was like, oh, you should do this and you should do that. I'm like, yeah, I should, because I want the results they had. But they're motivated by a different why. And trying to mirror or model their approach and their technique maybe stripped the joy out of it for me and made it feel too much like work. It made it feel too much like something I can't do right now. It'll have to wait till later. And so I decided that this year, my birthday was in December, so my new year started December 1st, my resurrection year. And so I want to get back to being me and doing things the way that I wanted to do them, incorporating some of the things that I've learned, but reminding myself of my why. So the tips that I would give any new podcasters is to start with what you have. Don't feel like it's not good enough. It can get better. There's nothing better for me right now than to listen to that first episode and listen to my most recent episode and see how much I've grown. I did that one on my laptop. I did my most recent episode using the Bluetooth microphone on my cell phone because I was tired of saying I don't have time or having to set up all the equipment. Okay, no, do it with what you have and you can edit it later. I now have this skill set. So start with why, start with what you have. Don't be overwhelmed by information. Learn what you need to learn, but don't feel like you have to do everything that you learn all at once.
Agree. That's a great tip. That information overload without application of one of them at some point, it can bog you down. And I definitely have my notes on my iPhone that is asinine. It doesn't even make any sense how many things that I'm going to read later at some point in my life. I'll be dead and gone. Notes will be as full as it is now without me having read most of it. So I definitely get that, and I appreciate that tip. You are a 2-time speaker, Afros in Audio, and I want, if you would, share about your experiences with the Afros in Audio Podcast Festival.
So the first year that I had the opportunity of having any participation, guest speaker with Afros in Audio was 2021. It was all virtual. I was very nervous. And I almost missed out on it. So I definitely want to say kudos to you and your team because AJ had been sending me emails and they were going to spam. So I didn't even know that my presentation had been accepted. And he found me on Instagram. He was like, hey, you going to sign the speaker contract or like what's going on? So I appreciate you all for that because it was phenomenal. Especially to be a virtual experience, the connections that I felt, the opportunities to be connected, giving the speakers a chance to know each other beforehand, having a DJ, having intentional icebreakers where people got to like this conversation itself. It's not just about the business of podcasting, it's about who I am as a person and how podcasting plays a role in that. And that was my introduction to Afros and audio. My introduction was applying to speak and not being allowed to fall through the cracks. It was like, no, we saw value in you and we want to make sure that you know that. Clearly, you're not getting our emails. How can we get in touch with you? And in the spirit of collaboration, I was paired to work with Cassandra, and she and I met a few times in preparation for our 2021 presentation. I got to know her, and she's dope. She's a really cool individual. So podcasting has continued to connect me to wonderful people who do things differently than I do them. And even if it's not something that is a value add directly to me and where I am in this space and time, I might know someone else who needs to benefit from Cassandra's services and what she does. And if I see something she's sharing on Instagram, I'm sending it to that person. Or I'm like, hey, Cassandra, did you see this opportunity here? And so, like I said, the virtual experience was phenomenal for me because with the Hoover app and everything that you all had going on, it was still very interactive. I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything. It was like, wow, I can't wait to meet these people in person. But like, I feel like I know y'all. And that was wonderful. So it motivated me to want to speak again, to want to attend again. And I did. And I feel very empowered by the Afros and audio family. Sometimes it's easy. Like I said, I haven't really been producing my podcast as often since I had my baby. And it's easy to feel disconnected. Like, am I still a podcaster? I don't have any new episodes. I don't have much new to share. You know, you can question yourself, you can doubt yourself, and it's easy to doubt yourself. But when you are in a community of individuals who see you and not just the download numbers or things of that nature, they don't see your stats. It gives you what you need to want to show up and show up better.
It's intentional, much like a lot of the things that you are doing. And so I see why we are community, and I appreciate you for choosing us as community because you are definitely valuable to us. And of course, with that being said, we want to be valuable to you as well. Thank you again, Shamiko, really for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I hope you did too. I really enjoy our interaction, our engagement. And I think that what you have to say and what you offer is so valuable that I just wanted you to show up and show out.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Any podcast that you want to shout out before I let you go? And then after you do that, let people know where they can find you and everything that you want to share.
Podcast that I want to shout out. I have listened to more podcasts since joining and being around Afros and audio than I ever did. Like before I started having a podcast, I did not really listen to them. So some of my favorites include Passing Through. They just came back with their new season after a long hiatus. That was the one where I found one of my guests through them. The Black Mental Health Podcast with Reginald Howard. He's one of my past guests, and he has some great episodes. I love the Mama's Den, produced by Black Love Network. Sanctified is a new one that I'm enjoying. And Cashmere Conversations by Imani Antoinette. That is not safe for work listening, but good content over there. So I like all of those podcasts. I have another one myself that I'm working on producing for alumna of my alma mater, Howard University. And I've done 4 of the interviews so far. So I'm excited about that. I am a Howard grad, class of 2012. And like I said, sometimes it's easy to doubt yourself. Howard produces greatness. And so when you feel like you're not operating at your best or your level of greatness and you see your peers surpassing you, it's easy to feel like a failure. And it's like, okay, well, we were in the same classes. We know the same people. What's going on differently for them than for me? And there are differences. But I realized that it wasn't me. I wasn't operating in a silo. I started seeing other classmates of mine sharing on social media that they too felt like we weren't living up to the Howard name. And I wanted to explore that and why that was. And some people who I think are absolutely dope who are not receiving the same support as other Howard grads. And it's like sometimes, I wonder how many people were in class with Chadwick Boseman or Lance Gross that thought they were corny before they made it. Or, they were having performances at the theaters on campus or other things that people didn't come out and support. And it's like, now you see me on TV. Oh, I know him. He was in my gym class. So just exploring what that's like, because I don't want any other Howard grads coming up behind us to feel inadequate, feel like they can't live up to the weight of the name. Like somebody asked me, why not all HBCUs? Why Howard? And I'm like, no disrespect to any other institution, because I'm not that person that likes to pit HBCUs against one another. But I do think that Howard graduates, or at least for myself, I personally feel that Howard graduates, because we receive so much media attention and other grads have so many accolades, that there's an expectation that when they hear you went to Howard, they don't expect you to be the janitor. Even if you own the janitorial company, that's not what somebody's expectation of a Howard grad is. And it makes it very challenging when you feel like, okay, I'm doing this thing and I haven't figured it out quite yet. Everybody around me is saying that because I went to this school, I should have it figured out, or I should be operating at this level by now. It's been 10 years out and you doing what? So I'm excited for that project. I'm excited that I got more participation than I anticipated. Like, in comparison to my first podcast, The Discussion Room, which kind of happened by accident, this one was more intentional. And I wanted to be more prepared before fielding guests. But I said, okay, it's the 10-year anniversary for my class. Let me see if other people in my class want to do it. Because I had a list of other grads, that I would love to speak to. Some people who went during the time that I went, who just have different lifestyles now that make them a little bit inaccessible, and some greats like Felicia Rashad and Debbie Allen, And I said, well, let me start with people I know. And I put it out there on my social media and had someone from our class social media account reach out to people. I put a Google form out there and I got more responses than I anticipated. And the first person I interviewed was somebody I never knew on campus. Wonderful conversation. That person has so much to share with people. So I'm excited.
That's awesome. What kind of support could you use around the podcast?
Definitely financial support. I want it to be a quality production. I don't want it to be a solo project. And I would like to be able to pay somebody to not just edit the audio, but create an experience, format wise and otherwise. Get clearances. I have a song in mind for intro music. I've got permission from all of the performers on the song, but they use the sample. It's like for a mixtape. So, just being able to do this as a Howard level project. So definitely financial support, definitely getting more alumna interested in the project, so that not just graduates, but even current students might be able to listen to it and navigate it. I'll share this, the same first episode, that person lost their parent. And they talked about being re-traumatized by financial aid every semester, having to provide their parents' death certificate. So just being able to share something like that, if there's a current student experiencing something, hearing a story like that might teach them a way to navigate that. Like, okay, I know I'm going to have to present my death certificate of my loved one. I'm gonna make sure I have a support person available on the day I go to financial aid, or I'm going to find out who's in charge of financial aid and say, hey, listen, I'm giving you this one time. Please don't ask me about it again. So just, you don't know what you don't know until you know it.
Absolutely. I can't wait for this project. I think it's super dope. As you know, my daughter attended Howard, and it's a great school. I did my SATs there, which is not the same thing at all, but I'm looking forward to the project. Tell people where they can find you.
I primarily hang out on the internet streets on Instagram at Dim Daddy, and that's DAAMN Daddy. You can also follow the Discussion Room Podcast on Instagram, or the Discussion Room Pod on Facebook. So that's facebook.com/the Discussion Room Pod. And just to find me much easier, damndaddy.com will take you to all those places. And then again, it's DAAMN Daddy.
Can you just go into really, really quickly how came up with that?
Oh, okay. So originally my podcast, my blog was dealing with daddy issues, on WordPress, dealing with daddy issues on WordPress.net or something like that. And somebody told me like that was kind of a turnoff, and people might not want to be dealing with their daddy issues, and they might avoid it. And so when I would be writing certain blog posts, at the end, a lot of it would be like, damn, daddy, you got effed up again. So, and then I have 3 primary father figures. So my biological father, stepdad number 1, and my sister's father are the figures that I spoke about most. And my logo has their 3 faces in it. So that's why there are 3 A's. But yeah, it was like thinking like, damn, Gina, so that's how that came about. I tried to do a journal a few years ago, and it was going to be bring analyzing and addressing my needs was the acronym for DAM.
Awesome. See, people can use their imagination with that. I wanted them to get the information. I wanted them to get the source, and that is, as always, that also is something that is deep and intentional, and that's kind of your stilo. I know I can recognize it because it's mine, that intentionality behind everything, that really critical thought behind something before you put it out there, the originality of it. So I appreciate all of that about you. I'm going to close this out and I ask you to just stay right there for me, all right?
Okay.
So I want to give a big thanks to our Afros in Audio and Black podcast community for supporting our commitment for community and collaboration. If you'd like to join the Black Podcasters Association, the link will be in the description below. And if you want to join us at the 5th annual Afros in Audio Podcast Festival, visit bit.ly AFAU, which will also be in the description. Follow us on all social media channels at Afros in Audio. Thanks again, Shamiko, for being a part of Afros in Audio's first ever Black History Month interview series. I really appreciated our conversation today.
Thank you for having me.